the new book, Distance Counseling and Supervision, a guide for mental health clinicians. We're both core faculty at Capella University and co-founders of PAX Consulting and Counseling, PLLC.
We'd like to give a very large thank you to Dr. Marty Gentius, who is producing this effort and behind the scenes to make things work. This is his brainchild and his vision, and he's a visionary for the counseling field. And so we're very, very grateful that he made this possible.
Counseling Delphi is a new video live streaming show that's going to be occurring every month on Sunday nights. Shows will be available later for viewing with transcription and will be converted to audio podcasts set up on all major podcast services. Look on the website www.CounselingDelphi.net for more information and upcoming panel topics.
This first live stream is on the topic of distance counseling and supervision, where we have gathered a group of panelists who will do a deep dive to further understand and address future advances for distance counseling and supervision.
Joining us are Dr. Jeffery Parsons, professor in the School of Professional Counseling at Lindsey Wilson College. He's former KCRAT chair, and he's a current member of the LPC board in the state of Kentucky. Our second panelist is Dr. Susan Belangee. She is the executive director for the North American Society of Adlerian Psychology and a counselor in private practice in Georgia with Canton Counseling.
We also have Dr. Jason Martin, associate professor of counseling with University of Mary Hardin-Baylor and clinical director for the Community Life Center at UMHB. Dr. Martin has served as liaison to the LMAFT board in the state of Texas, and he's currently president-elect of the Texas Association for Licensed Marriage and Family Therapists. So a little bit of background, everybody here is all part of the book, Distance Counseling and Supervision. And we wanted to tell you just a little bit about the background about how everyone came together. There are additional people that aren't here today because they're off doing amazing things. But in about 2016, I was chair of ACA ethics and you were ACA policies and bylaws chair.
Policies and bylaws.
And we started getting questions. We were in a large town hall meeting and started getting a lot of questions about distance counseling. And at that point in time, we deferred to state licensure boards. And we had about 300 people in the room, and we got a question and we explained that we deferred, and they said, well, we're with a licensure board from such and such a state and we defer to you. And so we said, wouldn't it be fun if we put a panel together and got all of these amazing people? And so we had these people that are here tonight, as well as Rachel McCrickard with Motivo and Harrison Tyner with We Counsel and Angela McDonald. And so we got a bunch of people together, and then that turned into the book. And so it's really an opportunity for some people who are just leaders in their areas to really come together and talk about this. So we're excited to have this conversation tonight. The panel has developed a set of questions and shared those amongst ourselves, and we'll also be taking questions from the live stream viewers if the time permits. So let's start off with our first question. Jeff Parsons, it goes to you. How has COVID-19 impacted regulations around the provision of distance counseling?
So this is a fantastic question, and there's a little bit of irony. Right before COVID came out, I joined a state task force in Kentucky to look at the issue of the provision of telehealth services. And the goal of this task force from the governor's office was to help to promote telehealth in the state of Kentucky. We're in a fortunate position compared to some states that we had regulations in place that outlined the provision of distance counseling, and we had just passed some laws around billing in that area as well. So they were really trying to use this group to help push the thing forward. That was in like the very beginning, the first week of March. By the end of April, we were like, wow, our job's done. COVID fixed it for us, because it really forced everybody into the deep end of the pool pretty immediately and unexpectedly. So when you look at where states are on this issue, or have been on this issue, they're kind of all over the map, pardon the pun. But some states are very regulated in this area. Other states have no regulation. Some states forbid telehealth services or perhaps distance counseling. I remember my first conversation with our state licensure board was about 12 years ago. I was doing a presentation on best practices at the time for doing distance counseling at one of our state conferences. A couple of board members came up from the back of the room. They said, "Hey, can we steal your stuff? We're trying to put something together because we don't know what this is. We don't know what to do with it." And I guess they did. So not too long after that, we ended up with some regulations around that area. But it's a big question mark because counselors are not traditionally techie people. And so it's this area where invariably the profession is always playing catch up on kind of the cultural change around us. Enter COVID. So all of a sudden, everybody is having to go online. Everybody is worried about how to do that appropriately. Many states don't have the infrastructure for it. So I think a few things have happened as a result of this very rapid onset of telehealth. The first thing is that many states have become, state licensure boards, I should say, have become much more comfortable with the idea of distance counseling. It's a little bit like, you're looking at the pool, maybe the pool is cold. I don't know if I want to get in the pool, and then somebody pushes you in and you go, "Oh, well, that wasn't as bad as I thought it was." And so a lot of states are warming up to the idea. Many states have put temporary provisions in place. For example, allowing for phone use as a form of provision, telehealth. That's likely going to be a temporary measure. I know it will be in the state of Kentucky, but to the degree that some states are actually billing things like Medicaid for phone services, simply because not everybody has the infrastructure at home to do a Zoom call or something along those lines. Billing is another area where there's been a lot of movement for states. There's also a registry process that a lot of states have implemented that allows counselors from outside of a state to sign up for the registry to get basically temporary permission to work with clients across state lines. And so all of this is setting the stage for what I think are some pretty big changes in our field. We've seen a lot of work with AASCB on a reciprocity agreement across multiple states. That was pre-COVID. During the same time that ACA was working on interstate compact through the Council for State Governments. So I think those two are in some ways different approaches to solving an issue. But what we're seeing happen is a lot of excitement among state boards because they realized playing with other states is not hurting them. They're not having to lower the bar. They're not having the kind of difficulties they might have anticipated in terms of the provision of services. So to that effect, states are already working through a regulatory process, a statutory process to sign up for this interstate compact. I think that has been propelled heavily because of COVID.
Thank you, Dr. Parsons, for that. Does anyone have anything they'd like to add to that?
I really like the idea that we've kind of jumped into the pool. And I think that really COVID is a game changer.
I think it was too. It forced people to do things that they weren't really ready to do. And I think really it's about client service delivery, ensuring that clients are continuing to receive services that are so badly needed. And then as I think about all the things that have been happening around the country, with our own experience here in Texas, with our deep freeze that occurred and over 4.5 million people without power, they're still counting the death toll. And so not only are we dealing with the COVID response from the public, now we have additional things. You hear about shootings, you hear about other disasters across the country. And so counseling services just can't stop. They just can't stop because of. And so I think really moving in this direction has been a very positive thing for the counseling community. I know with our own experiences moving online, and when we closed our physical location and went online, all of our clients came with us, and now they absolutely love the service.
We've been able to see them during COVID quarantines.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's provided a healthy alternative and a safe alternative. And since then, we've just been flooded with requests to receive counseling services. And so because of that, I think it's really catching on. I think clients really like it. I think they like the safety aspect of it. And I think if it's done well, it can be a very safe option.
Well, I think it shifted it from a fringe practice into a mainstream practice. And I think that's the game changer, is that now this is something that not just people who are going to function a little bit above the mainstream practice, but everyone has now tried it out.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's a little bit of a two-edged sword, and there are some regulatory pieces that still have to be figured out. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Because you're right, it was kind of a fringe practice, and now it's become more mainstream. But there are questions that are unanswered. For example, is it okay for a counselor to provide counseling services from their own home, which has been a very common occurrence in COVID? But can you do that and do it in an ethical manner when your dog's barking in the background, or you've got small children at home because you're a parent? These kinds of things have been bubbling up. There are some confidentiality issues for clients. For example, young kids who don't feel safe having a counseling session in a video conference format because mom or dad is in the other room trying to listen in, or kind of trying to influence or pressure the child in some way. So there's some downsides. The other thing that we're running into in some segments is Zoom burnout. So counselors that are doing 5, 6, 7, 8 sessions in a row on Zoom and are getting fatigue from that. And so some people are loving it, some clients are loving it, some counselors are loving it. But I think there's a bipolar response to that, bimodal, I suppose, in the sense that you've got some people that are really drawn back and saying, no, I want the real thing. I want that face-to-face interaction. So, I think we've stirred the pot, and now we have to kind of assess and see, okay, what do we keep and what do we need to adjust in order to make this really work long term?
So one of the things that you bring up is, would it be ethical or legal to see someone from your house? And when I'm thinking about that, I think about so many clinicians that had kind of home offices prior to COVID, especially those who were kind of starting private practice. But I also feel your pain when you're talking about that, because I've noticed that I have some clients where you aren't quite sure if they're the only person in the room, or a child wakes up and automatically just pops into the video. And so I think you're completely right. You lose a sense of clinical control over the environment. And I think that's one of the big challenges.
Does anyone else have any contributing thoughts?
Yeah, one of the, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jason.
Well, I was just going to say, I couldn't agree more. And I think to your point, we had to, at our clinic, our training clinic, we integrated distance counseling and telehealth into our clinic, when we decided to reopen after COVID had come about, and we had to figure out what to do. And, I kind of had to create a crash course in telehealth and in distance counseling for our students. And that was one of the things that we really had to emphasize, is that when you have face-to-face counseling, the counselor has a lot more control over the therapeutic environment. And you lose that with telehealth. There are a lot of benefits, a lot of good reasons to practice distance counseling, but that's one drawback, is that you don't have the same control over the therapeutic environment. And so we had to kind of educate our students on how to mitigate that a little bit, how to educate their clients about what they can do to have a better therapeutic experience. And this isn't so much about the regulatory part, but I think one thing that COVID definitely did is, I think it showed the entire mental health community, both counselors as well as legislators, as well as insurance companies, that telehealth and distance counseling is something to be contended with. This isn't just something, this is one of those permanent changes that COVID has brought, and there's no going back. This is here to stay. And Jeff, I agree with you. There is kind of a bimodal reaction to it. I've had some students who say, hey, this is pretty cool, and I like doing this. I have one student in particular who, her internship site went entirely online, and all of her internship experience, other than we were able to reopen in person some in limited capacity at our on-campus training clinic. So she's gotten some face-to-face experience there, but otherwise it's been entirely online. And she says, as soon as I don't have to do this anymore, I don't want to do distance counseling for a long, long time if I don't have to. And she's not the only one who's had that kind of reaction. But I think one thing that COVID has done, probably the biggest thing that COVID has done when it comes to our practice as counselors, is that it has placed distance counseling front and center in terms of of what the profession has to do. Training clinics are going to have to train for this, or training programs are going to have to train for this. Clinics are going to have to prepare for clients who want or need distance counseling. So even people who may not have provided those or wouldn't have provided those services previously are going to have to at least have an answer for that, because they're going to get clients who call or contact them and want that service.
I think another piece that's kind of connected to all of that, when you talk about training, a flurry, and this is a great thing, a flurry of free training became available almost instantly. You couldn't shake a stick without hitting 2 or 3 free online trainings on doing distance counseling. Some of those were like a little 1-hour piece that somebody put together. There are 45-hour training programs you can go through. So the variability in not just content, but depth is staggering. And so we run into an interesting situation. Well, what does it mean to be trained to do online counseling? Do we really understand the fundamentals of that? Because now everybody has, quote unquote, had training, but who knows what the quality of that training is and whether or not there's consistency in that training from, clinician to clinician. And so there's still probably work to do in that area as well, and kind of really getting down to grassroots and saying, okay, well, what are the fundamentals that we need to have some consistency on in the profession, so that we know that we have been trained appropriately.
Susan, were you going to offer something a minute ago?
Yeah, I think Jason and I are on the same page. Our practice thankfully had an infrastructure we basically, from, the first day of shutdown, we just said, okay, here we go, we're online. So we had all of the technology, ready and up and running. And so we were pretty seamless. It was interesting at first. I had clients who said, I want no part of this. Let me know when you're back face to face in 30 days, right? We all thought we were going to flatten the curve and it was going to be great. So I'll come back in a month. So after about 2, I sent an email and said, this isn't going away anytime soon. Do you want to, we have this option. Do you want to take advantage of it? And so there are some that were reluctant. And then again, like Jason said, kind of had this, oh, this is really cool. I like this. And then, we hit, the December holidays and January, and people are like, okay, I'm starting to grow weary of this. When do we anticipate being back in the office? And I have several colleagues who already went back face to face. And I have been a holdout, just because of my own personal reasons to stay in the telehealth side. But I'm looking, now that I'll be vaccinated, looking to maybe go back into the office. And I have some clients that are just thrilled, can't wait to be back in an office setting when I shared that with them. And then I have some others like, you know what, I think I'm good. I think we can keep doing it this way until insurance won't pay. And I think, as Jeff has already said, like, this is now the force to contend with, right? So we're definitely going to have, I think, those supplemental codes for insurance from here on out. So yeah, it's definitely, COVID has definitely pushed us into that deep end of the pool. And I think some of the things that we're going to have to figure out as a profession are how do we actually train, and where we used to require face-to-face hours, are we now also going to require a certain number of telehealth hours? So I'm interested to see what the field does with that.
I'm going to circle back around to something both Jeff and Jason said, and it's about educating and informing clients about this and ways they can protect themselves, especially in their home environment. And that's one of the things we continue to do with our clients, especially as we take on new clients, is to help build in protections. In fact, we dedicated a page on our website that's specifically about telehealth. It's a button. It's the very first button they can see in the list. And it's funny because the list keeps growing of things that we ask the client to do in their own home environment to ensure that they're in a safe place. And every time we learn about something new or we hear about something new, we try to update that list and keep it going. And it's really interesting. It spans from making sure you're in a safe place, you're not driving a car, but also turning off smart devices, smart home devices, ensuring that Discord, your gaming platform, chat room is shut down, and ensuring that other forms of smart communication that are listening or smart technology that's listening is not activated. I had one client in particular, every time we'd get on, I would say, "Hello, Alexa." And it instantly you could hear it in his room. He'd say, "Oh, hold on, let me turn it off." And he'd go and unplug the device because it was something so common for him. And so it became a running joke at the beginning of every one of our sessions together. And so I think this idea of, not only training students, but training clients, helping clients understand what it is this means and how we're going to do this safely. And so I'm constantly referring clients back to the website to go through the checklist to make sure that they're doing things in their home environment that helps them maintain that safety, that anonymity, that confidentiality, and that privacy. And so I think it's to go with Jeff's metaphor of a double-sided sword. It's also going to be educating clients, helping them understand how to do this in a very good, in a safe way.
I'm going to continue that thought about the paradox here, because I think we also have the issue of socioeconomic accessibility. And so I think for my clients that had technology means, I think this was a very, very easy transition. However, our nieces go to school in a place that 73% of the children don't have internet in their homes. And so when we start talking about service to rural areas or to impoverished areas, this can be a little tricky. Now, the flip side of that is that it does allow greater accessibility. So in our state, one of the things that has been discussed is, okay, does this mean that the state needs to be involved in a rural internet infrastructure initiative that they had kind of let go a few years ago? And so I think it's a really interesting thing when we talk about the social justice aspect of this, because it allows the possibility of accessibility, not just to therapy, but to therapy with a counselor who maybe is specializing in whatever that client is looking for. And it's not just going to be proximity. And I think the same goes for supervision. I think we now have the ability to have supervision in a better, more appropriate way with people who are more well suited to doing the supervision that needs to happen. However, I feel like that there's this balance between what is kind of available and then what is possible. Right.
Okay, Susan, I've got a two-part question for you. I'm going to go ahead and fire them both to you, okay, and let you have them. So what is one caution you'd offer to digital natives, millennials and Gen Z? And what is one positive reason you'd offer to digital immigrants, like us old folks, for integrating distance counseling and supervision into practice?
So just to make sure everybody's on the same page. So these two terms came out as Kia and I were working on our chapter for the book. And so a digital native is someone who, has grown up with technology. It's always been a part of their livelihood or, lives playing video games or, having a phone or a device in your hand or an iPod or, so they've had some form of technology pretty much most of their lives. So if you think about natives being born anytime, up until the mid 90s, those are the millennials. Gen Z comes after that. And then us old folks were the digital immigrants, which means, we've already knew a life without technology. And so we've had to learn how to integrate various aspects of technology, some of us a little faster than others. And so that's those of us born typically before 1981. So I myself am an immigrant, born in 1973. So for me, I remember, life way before there was a computer. I remember my mom typing my senior paper for high school on a typewriter. So, things like that. So that's the difference between digital natives and digital immigrants. So for natives who have grown up with technology and not really knowing life without it, for them, they may overlook some things that they wouldn't have thought of without having that experience of not having technology. So the one example I came up with in terms of a caution is sometimes if all you see on a screen is somebody from, like most of us are tonight, from shoulders up, there may be lots of things that you miss in terms of counseling practice. And so natives who think, technology is great and doing counseling this way, no problem. What if you had a client who looks good from here up, but then has fresh injuries from self-harm behaviors on their legs or their lower arms? And unless you knew that that was a history for a client, or unless you had a way to assess that client top to bottom, head to toe, you might miss something. And so that's the one caution that came to mind in terms of those natives. They may not think that if you don't have the experience sitting in front of a client and getting to view their whole self, you may not think of those kinds of questions to ask. So that's the one caution. The one encouragement for us old folks, us immigrants, in terms of incorporating the technology. I think Jenny and Dan, you spoke about it. It's that accessibility and flexibility. The benefit of being able to reach a wider audience, being able to offer services, in ways that or that reaches people that never would have been eligible or able to receive services previously. So one of the neat things that's happened within the last week, and maybe others will talk about this, is the Counseling Interstate Compact. And Georgia, that's where I am, has agreed to sign on to this compact. And within the last, 2 weeks or so, I've had a couple of clients reach out to me through another listserv that I'm on, since my specialty is eating disorders. And up until this week, I had to say, going across state lines isn't something we can do just yet. So I'm really excited to see how that all evolves. But that's my take on this question.
Does anyone else have any thoughts about that?
The thing that comes to mind as I'm listening to Susan speak is back in the 90s and early 2000s, I remember reading in the counseling journals where they talked about those of us who were in the field and who weren't going to become actively engaged in the emerging technology would not be qualified to be able to supervise the use of technology. And I'm thinking about now how many interns I see that are actually the expert, quote unquote, at the site for the technology. And so this is a really interesting power shift in a lot of places. And so this idea of where does the power lie and what is the comfort level? And I think those comfort levels are very, very different depending on whether or not you grew up with it or not.
I think there's a flip side to that though. Because I was one of those that was like, oh yeah, these younger people, they're going to know all about the technology and it will be great. I've always been kind of techie, so I was waiting for people to catch up. The reality is that we know what we use. And so for younger generations, they may be more tech savvy about some things, but maybe not the things that they need to be, or maybe not about the things that are relevant, for example, to distance counseling. In fact, it can work against them. Because younger generations are far more loose about things like confidentiality, oversharing through social media is kind of part of their norm, and retraining them away from that. And it can pop up in ways you wouldn't expect. I had a student probably 5-6 years ago that said, well, my full-time job, I'm a professional blogger. I blog about the personal life of myself and my spouse. Is that going to be a problem if I'm a counselor? And how do you manage that? How do you navigate that? So helping younger generations to retrain toward a counseling orientation in the use of technology and making sure that we don't make assumptions about what they know. Because sometimes they're brilliant with it. And other times they really do need help in ways that we might kind of write off and say, well, they probably already know this when they don't.
All right, so we have a question for Jason. Jason, licensing boards are beginning to adopt rules to govern the practice of distance counseling, but it still feels like each state and country is its own silo of regulation. How can we better move toward regulation, allowing true counseling without borders, embracing the capabilities that distance counseling promises?
Well, not to make too much of a callback, but I think COVID-19 did a lot to kind of demonstrate the need for that. Like we were discussing earlier, I think anyone who may have been skeptical or had concerns, they may still be skeptical and have concerns to some degree, but they at least, I think, see the need for some kind of interstate or even international cooperation along this topic. One of the things that I think has kind of thwarted those efforts here in Texas is, Texas, the legislators, the regulators very much see, they are very much of the Texas spirit. Like, we do our own things. Nobody tells us what to do, right? I can think of a few licensure board members who would definitely, take the position of, well, that may be good for California, that may be good for Arkansas, that may be good for New York, but is it good for Texas? And there is some skepticism about people who are not trained or vetted in specifically, according to each and every rule that Texas may have, granting them a license or allowing them to practice in the state or allowing them to practice with citizens of the state. And there's no way around it, in my opinion, at this point, that we're going to have to figure something out. So the way to bring down those silos, first of all, I think is twofold. One is that people, like practitioners in the state, need to become aware of, okay, what actually are the barriers to practicing between two different states? What are the barriers that keep that from happening? Is it simply a matter of, sometimes it may just be a matter of getting the decision makers, the regulators, to talk to each other a little bit better. The regulatory boards may not necessarily, they do have a, in marriage and family therapy, there's AMFTRB, the regulatory board for marriage and family therapy. And I know that there's a comparable board for counseling as well. And that helps, but not every state board is not every state board is in as regular communication with that as they probably could be. And so having the clinicians, as well as the general public, it doesn't have to be just the clinicians, but the general public, to talk to the boards and get them to be more in communication with those overarching bodies, those interstate bodies that can help make those decisions, is one step in the right direction. The compact that was recently discussed is another effort. Now that is a little bit different than pure license portability, but it may offer a lot of the same benefits. And so that may be kind of a next step. And that is something also that Texas is going to be looking at, that I know that I attend all of the licensure board meetings here, and that is something that came up on the agenda at the last meeting. And I believe that they kind of tabled it to get some more information. So they're looking at it. I'm optimistic that something might get done. But like I said, kind of that independent maverick spirit in Texas kind of makes that a little challenging. But frankly, I know Texas has that reputation, but they're not the only ones. Lots of states are skeptical about entering purely into that. And a lot of it's going to be, familiarizing yourself with exactly what is the process. Is it something that the state legislature would need to change? Or is it something that the specific licensure board would have the authority to implement rules around that? That's going to vary from one state to the next. So I think people need to get educated about exactly how that works in their particular state, and then lobby those bodies, either lobby the state legislature or lobby your licensure board. And then the second thing is, really engaging with the federal government on this. While the federal government is, licensure is a state mandate. That's not something that's done at the federal level anyway. But the federal government can offer guidance for that, and the Department of Commerce can certainly help facilitate some of this as well. That's one area that, frankly, I don't have a lot of experience with, but I know that would need to be part of that process. And so getting more educated about that. And, I'll just say that the more that that clients want this, the more that the consumer asks for it and demands it, the more that the decision makers will be kind of incentivized to find some way to make that happen. And so I think the more that we are asking that we offer this for our clients in state, the more that they're going to expect that. And so I think just practicing, even if there isn't much that we're doing out, interstate or between states or internationally, if we're offering distance counseling and if we're making that an option available to the people that are within the bounds of what our license may cover, then that's going to normalize the experience to make it seem a lot less intimidating and a lot less scary, and B, make that something that the public is going to want, and they're gonna see it as ridiculous. These artificially drawn lines around states. They're going to begin seeing that and asking and demanding for some kind of interstate cooperation as well.
So one of the things we hear a lot with our consulting arm of our agency is the ability to continue care as clients travel. So one of the things I'm hearing you say is that as the consumer really demands this, that might be something that is something that we can provide. But that's when we have counselors who have clients who travel in any kind of mobile kinds of job, and the definition of residency varies so much from state to state, that becomes a real gray area. And so I wonder, and this I'll pose to Jeff, do you think that states that have adopted the CACREP curriculum will be more open to the idea of portability and the idea of states' rights versus what Jason's saying? Texas, the licensure board hasn't adopted CACREP as a standard. So do you feel like that will be a defining characteristic?
I don't know that it will, which probably surprises you for me to say that. But here's what I'm seeing, and I was really hearing what Jason was saying about. I think there are a lot of states out there that take a lot of pride in their standards, and they see it as, well, we put these licensure standards in place to ensure quality, and that state doesn't have this, therefore they must not be of quality. And there's a little bit of one-upmanship that sometimes happens on state boards. And I think what's happened because of telehealth and COVID and all of that it's brought those barriers down, and people are seeing that there's a lot more in common than there is different. I'm on a it's a regulatory excellence task force for AASCB that was working on reciprocity before COVID. It's about 24 states that have been looking at reciprocity and what that might look like, how we could implement it. And so one of the things that we did is we data gathered across all of the members of this group, these 24 states, to see, well, what's the baseline? What's the most common denominator for requirements? And what we found is that while there's still a relatively small number of states that have formally adopted CACREP, the vast majority, like 80, 90%, are going to require 60 hours of training. They're going to require the CACREP domains. They're going to require internship and practicum. They're going to have somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 hours of supervised experience and some kind of test, whether that's the NCE or something else, might vary. But that, what I just outlined is probably the common value set across 90% of the boards out there. And once people in that working group figured that out, they were a lot more open to the idea of whether it's reciprocity or interstate compacts, that was viable. Then COVID hit. Here's what I think COVID did that's remarkable, is it moved states from having a conversation about should we do something about telehealth to having to do something with telehealth. The real battle, I think, at this point is going to be the interstate communication, whether it's reciprocity or compacts. I think that's going to be a longer discussion. The other big piece is going to be billing, because states vary heavily in this area. And even in Kentucky, where we had pushed through some regulations ensuring that you could bill for telehealth before COVID. Great thing. But it's got a provision in it that the providers, that there can be a negotiation between, Anthem, for example, and these other companies and the people providing the healthcare. And what that negotiation usually looks like is trying to drive the billing down. So we're not going to pay you as much as we would for real counseling because you did it online or what have you. So I think that that's going to be a major sticking point, along with just general reciprocity across state lines. But I think both of those have been propelled forward probably 5 or 10 years. That even though those are going to be sticking points, they're going to be far, it's not going to take 10 years to have those conversations. It might be two or three or five instead.
Okay, we're going to take a couple of questions from the audience.
So the first question comes from Elliot, and he asked, I was asked to do a 3-hour CE course on Intro to Telehealth. I was totally blown away in what I learned about the hardware software security needs. Should ACA mimic what the Association for American Medical Colleges do in respect to that training? It was those standards, but what they saw was, and what they did was at a minimum, and it was way beyond what this person found in the non-medical professions. And so in terms of that training, would it behoove ACA to adopt some kind of standard like that? What does the group think?
Well, I was going to jump in before we went to Elliot's question. And, one of the things that I think we're all in agreement on is the way COVID has really pushed us forward. I think, Jeff, you're right, 5-10 years at a minimum. In the research, there was maybe 43%, I think I have that right, of mental health state licensing boards that had a minimal policy regarding telemental health services. In addition to that, across many of these states that might have a policy, there were 19 different terms to talk about telemental health services. And I remember even in the editing of the book, we all adapted from one term to what eventually got published, which was telebehavioral health. And so I think that those are the nitty-gritty kinds of things that are going to get ironed out. But to Elliot's point, if we have that many terms and so many state boards that have no policy, back as of 2016 was that article. I'm really curious to see how many are scrambling right now to figure out, how are we going to do this? How are we going to have the training? How in depth and in detail is it going to have to go to ensure that clients are safe and the systems that we're using are all compliant and so on. I think it's I think it's pushed us, but I think we're also going to be like, hey, we forgot about this thing too.
Susan, I think you bring up such a great point with the terms, because I'm thinking about our initial proposal and how many different sets of editors went through and asked us to change the title. And we're not just talking about ACA, but when we were proposing this to other publishers as well, the field really was arguing back and forth as to what do we call this. And I think that it changed at least 3 times. Mm-hmm. And I think in our last iteration, there was a request to change it again. And so I think even the terminology that we're using to talk about what we're doing, it's very fluid. And I think that one of the things that I hear people struggle with is they'll say, well, I'm using this. Is it HIPAA compliant? And we'll say, well, it depends. And so that is, I think, very angst provoking for a lot of people, because I think most of us want to be in compliance, but it's a very nebulous area for counselors.
Well, and if I can just jump in, the terminology debate is not over, and we're still, even regulatory bodies are still wrestling with exactly what to call this. Texas kind of settled on technology assisted services, but frankly, that's not going to stick. Nobody's using that term. Nobody will use that term. But exactly what we settle on there, and as well as the other terminology, and you mentioned HIPAA compliant. I mean, HIPAA and high tech have a lot of catching up to do, frankly, and so there's going to be a lot more to that in the coming years. I don't know how soon it's going to be, but I think it's going to be pretty soon that we're going to have to contend with additional privacy regulations around this that hopefully might simplify some things, but will complicate others.
Well, and to the definitional piece, it's not just what we call it, but what we mean by it. So for example, in Kentucky, distance counseling means visual. There's video conferencing embedded in that, and it specifically prohibits phone, although there's a temporary waiver on that. So yeah, figuring out, well, what do we mean by distance counseling? What are we going to call distance counseling? And back to the original question of, should ACA adopt? That's a really interesting question, because, and I don't want to speak for ACA, I don't think they're the folks to do that. So, ACA is going to look at a code of ethics, and like any good code of ethics, it's very generic and very broad. So they're going to say, be competent in the use of technology, but they're not going to define that for us, right? They can't, because the technology changes too quickly and all of those kinds of things. So I think what the viewer was asking was, hey, this was really concrete, and it told me what I needed to know and how to do what I needed to do. And ACA is never going to do that. CACREP will never do that. So CACREP does educational standards for counseling programs, and they probably need to beef up, if personal opinion, some of the standards about training in doing distance counseling and supervision. But even if they do, it will be very broad. It will be, here's stuff you need to know. Probably the organization best equipped to answer that question in terms of standards for training is going to be NBCC, because that's their bailiwick. That's what they do, is certification and training. So it's very complicated, though, because every organization, ACA, CACREP, and NBCC, probably wants to have a voice in that conversation, but they all have different pieces of the pie, if that makes sense.
So in that conversation, Jeff, that you're having, where does the state licensure board fall?
Well, most good state licensure boards rip off their standards from other states. That's kind of how it works. They look to see what everybody else is doing. And so hopefully you find a sampling of some states that have a set of regulations that are reasonable and that the members of that licensure board can deal with. And often they already do this, right? They already rely on often the NBCC tests as part of licensure. It wouldn't be surprising to me if they started to do that with distance counseling and say, yeah, you can do distance counseling, but we want you NBC certified in that area. So yeah, boards, like everybody else in the counseling profession, are not experts in this area. And so they're playing catch up and trying to figure it out just like the rest of us are.
I think that one of the things that will be interesting to see how the board for each state is clear about their expectations and how they communicate that to the counselors in their state. I feel like that's just such an instrumental piece.
I'm hoping that state organizations as well partner with the licensing authority to help communicate those out. Very often licensure boards hold the position that they expect their licensees to, search out the law. You find out on your own. We're not going to hold your hand and help you understand that. And so one of the recommendations I have for anyone who's out there listening is to join the listservs in your state, if those are available. Join either the licensing authorities listserv or your state organization's listserv, so that you can receive legislative updates. Anytime there's something happening here in Texas, legislative blasts go out over the listserv. And so we're made aware by our state organizations. And I recommend staying abreast of that so that you know exactly where you stand and what you're to be doing and not to be doing. Okay, we had a clinical question that came in from Heather, and I'll put this to the group as well. In working with clients, what issues do you see with clients who would benefit more from in-person, but may be reluctant to engage due to issues related to social anxiety, etc.? Are we enabling these clients when they refuse anything other than telehealth services as services become more prominent? Group, what do you guys think?
That's an interesting question. I think that for right now, though that is definitely one of the treatment issues and the clinical issues that we've yet to really work through very well. I think that is coming, and it's kind of like any relatively new emergent effort in the field, is that it takes a little while for us to figure out how is all this going to play out? What are the implications that we never would have thought of coming into it? And I think the scenario that Heather describes, I think is perfectly within that. Now, I could see that as a potential enabling issue. I certainly could see that. I could also see it as something that could, I kind of fall into sort of, I guess you would say the Yalom frame of mind, where I want to put out there and say, let's have the meta conversation about what's going on in the counseling environment in the room. And so as a clinician, I might try to identify that as a potential and engage with the client around that. If I have a good therapeutic rapport, then I would want to make sure that they could hear that genuinely and honestly from me. And maybe that would be used as sort of as a step forward, as an intervention of sorts. The intervention is, instead of meeting in online this week, we're going to meet in person, and work towards that goal. So it could be part of the therapeutic framework. But as with anything that could potentially become enabling, or that could help perpetuate problematic behaviors on the part of the client, it's something that we can engage in a dialogue with the client about, from whatever theoretical position you have, that may be an issue that is dealt with through the therapeutic framework. Now, exactly how that works out, again, there are probably, Heather brings up one instance. There are probably innumerable instances of this that none of us have thought about necessarily, but that we need to be on the lookout for, and that we need to be mindful of, and that we need to be engaging with our clients about, but also we need to be engaging with our colleagues and our peer groups about, as well, as we kind of explore this. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a second or third edition of this distance counseling book that addresses things like that. That addresses the therapeutic issues that will emerge and that are emerging as distance counseling becomes more common.
I agree, Jason, and I really think that it's going to be highly individualized depending on the person and depending on who the client is and the issues they're bringing. And just from my own theoretical perspective, just thinking about ways to help that person engage. Part of that person's treatment plan is probably going to be involving some other forms of work outside of the therapeutic connection and the therapeutic work we do in office. And I'm hoping, and I'm going to borrow from some very old school Adlerians here, Guy Manister, one of his great stories that I loved dearly was really using the therapeutic time with the client as the check-in to see how all that was working for them. How that movie and that dinner and those other things that they're doing socially is working for them. And what kind of adjustments can we make to that? So I'm hoping that the client will have some therapeutic options and things they'll engage in on their own in between the sessions. And so, and this is something that I do in my own practice in terms of helping, my clients is as they identify things that they would really enjoy trying in between our time together. That's where I really love using our time, is so we can check in and kind of see how that's working for them and see what kind of tweaks can be made and what kind of successes they're experiencing with that. And so, but I do think it's going to be highly individualized. And I do agree with Jason on that. It's really going to be based on the client and what they come to your door with or your virtual screen with. And so it's going to be very much individualized, and we're going to be learning as we go along. We're all freshmen in this particular school of thought, and we're all learning as we grow.
Heather, when I think about this question, I think about readiness for change. And I think about the zone of proximal development that Vygotsky talks about, and how we could use telehealth to kind of move the client toward the ability to come into the office. Because I wonder with a lot of clients if they will refuse services because they aren't ready to go in, and if they're ready to stay with it initially. And so one of the things we've noticed is we went from about a 25% no-show rate to almost a 0 no-show rate when we switched to telehealth. Because if someone forgets a session and we send them a little note and say, hey, are you okay? They'll just jump on. Or if a lot of them, even when they were quarantined, they still would want to meet because there was so much anxiety. The other thing that has been interesting with the treatment of anxiety for us in our practice has been the use of personal animals during session. So we'll have clients who are very anxious, and they'll have cats and dogs and other pets kind of
and birds
all around them. And I think that it helps them to be in that familiar setting. So I think that the short answer to this very complex question is we have to use that and factor into our clinical judgment. Is this something that is not good for our client right now? Are they well suited for this modality of therapy?
Well, and kind of, Jen, to your point and Susan's point earlier, this is, and I think we should retitle the book. It should be Distance Counseling, a Two-Edged Sword, because, Susan was talking about, well, there's some things you can't see. If there's been cutting or something like that going on, you don't see that. The flip side to that is you do get to see the environment that the client is in a way that you would never have that opportunity, if you were in a traditional clinical setting. And so one could call that a form of an advantage in getting a little bit of a peek into the client's world. I do think there are some clients, though, that are severely disadvantaged through telehealth, particularly very, very young kids. So once you get to the point where you can do, as my spouse likes to call it, talk therapy, then telehealth works very well. But if you're working with a 3 or a 4-year-old, or you're working with a young kid and you're trying to do sand tray with them or something like this, then all of a sudden you have a huge problem. And so I think for some populations, again, younger populations, just because of who they are developmentally, that telehealth poses a real set of challenges for therapists by forcing a modality that maybe they wouldn't normally use with a young child.
Jeff, I agree with that. And it's just to kind of speak to everybody's words about this, is it's not for everyone. It's not for all clients. And in my own practice, in our own practice, I've continued to see children and work with children. And I've worked through that sand tray issue by finding some programs where I can use a virtual sand tray. And the child absolutely adores it. In fact, that's his favorite activity. We still play physical games quite a bit online using just varying formats. And even this last week, we were playing some games, but we with all the different forms of play that we engage in, I would say among his most favorite is the virtual sand tray. The child has control over building that world. And I've had a great amount of success with this particular child. And I started with him in office, and I've been working with him for a couple of years now. And the child has made just significant strides in his work. But yeah, I actually picked up Terry Koppman, the creator of Adlerian Play Therapy, published a book on in interventions. There's like 73 interventions in this quick made guide, and it's available on her site, encouragementzone.com. And I picked it up, and because she had many of her trainees and people she'd trained over the years contribute to this book, and it's flush with so many different wonderful activities, and it explains the therapeutic process with each activity. And many of those can be adapted for not only working with adolescents and young adults, but older adults as well. And so I've had a great amount of fun incorporating some of that into the different counseling sessions with a lot of my different clients. And because we see clients of all ages.
But it's so different. We're having to learn what modalities work,
right,
and what don't using this
Yeah.
And think about the nascent nature of this right now, that we are really at the precipice of finding out what this can do, and what new opportunities this may have, but also what challenges exist. And so, it's pretty straightforward what can be done with the talk therapy. But if you try to adapt, one-to-one what you do in a play therapy context or a sand tray context, it doesn't work. And so this easy solution would be to say, well, I guess that just can't adapt to distance counseling. That play therapy, sand tray just doesn't work in a distance context. Well, maybe it doesn't in the traditional way, but there are other ways that we may be able to figure out. And what does that look like? Dan, I think it's great that you've discovered or maybe found or created some resources that allow you to do that. But frankly, I would suspect that you might even admit that this is like the bare bones beginning. It's kind of like pre-Model T Ford era in terms of looking at what the possibilities might be and what the future might actually hold.
I agree, Jason. And in fact, sometimes I feel like I'm on a pogo stick, and that's as fast as I can go with it because the technology is just limited right now. I feel like Tony Stark's dad in the movie, in Iron Man, where he's saying, "I'm limited by the technology of my day." That's exactly how I feel sometimes. We have certain limitations, and we're doing what we can to reach across to help with so many of these clients. And again, our number one reason for closing our clinical space, not only for personal reasons, but was also because we work with fragile clients. And for them to be able to continue services, they needed that virtual environment, including the little boy I'm working with. Health-related concerns prohibit, physical contact and physical presence because of, concerns, significant health concerns. And so because of that, I really think this has been very helpful. Again, I do feel sometimes strapped and tied and have to get quite creative as we move along. But it is really, the multimedia interface has offered so many new opportunities. So when I'm working with couples, I can throw up a Gottman screen, and talk about the Four Horsemen, or I can talk about, they had Larry and Crucial Seas that Betty Lou Bettner and Amy Lou created. And I can throw these concepts up, and it's almost the same as me handing a piece of paper to my client in session. Because very often I would hand them that document and show that to them. Here, I can just throw it up on the screen, and we're talking through them together.
Well, I think it's an interesting phenomenon because we've also been able to work with clients together that are couples that are not residing in the same area.
Right. Yeah.
And that, I think, has been a benefit for telehealth because in our physical space, we wouldn't be able to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting. All right, there's a question for you, Dan.
Okay.
What recommendations do you have for counselors who are trying to become technologically competent?
And this is something I'm going to refer back to something Elliot offered, is find some trainings. And it's going to be important. This is one of those times and one of those moments where you've got to just immerse yourself. Immersion helps considerably. Reading what you can. One of the first steps I would say when you're, we cover this in the book in terms of how to vet different software and different hardware providers, is ask these different services for their white papers. The first time you ask a sales representative for white papers, they're going to have a very stunned look on their face because most of the public doesn't know about the white papers. But the white papers describe how that company maintains their encryption standards, or how they maintain HIPAA compliance or compliance with high tech. And so having those papers and understanding what they mean and how they read, I think that's an important step. Learning about it, there are so many different YouTube videos. I would say find some digital natives too. Buy them a pizza. Have them show you how to work that Wi-Fi newfangled machine, and have them teach you about what encryption means and what a VPN does. I think just coupling up and partnering with newer generations of users is going to be incredibly helpful. There is a distinct language out there. And once you start learning the vocabulary and educating yourself about what these standards look like, you'll start understanding how to build in safeguards for yourself, for your practice, but as well as for the client side. And I think that to me is as critically important as anything else, is me educating my clients on how to do this in a safe way. And so I mentioned that earlier in the session, that we have to really embrace this idea of learning the language, getting behind it, practicing with it, but also spending some time exploring what's coming next, knowing what the technology is capable of doing tomorrow, and building this in for clients to understand too. Wi-Fi isn't just the same Wi-Fi for everybody. A lot of people don't understand how to secure their own Wi-Fi system at home. I've been working with Jeff Parsons for many, many, many years, and he and I were the tech nerds in our department. We helped them transition to Gmail from an old MSN or Microsoft system. It's really interesting just to see some of that growth happen. And so we maintain just this leading component with our department, and we've continued to try to stay up with the times. I mean, I'm learning every day myself. And so reading tech news helps, especially some of the different websites. Learning the language is a huge piece to this. And as you continue to build your own systems out, understanding ways to make it safe for you, your family, your clients. And I think it's just a matter of just immersing yourself in the language and the technology and in the culture. It's here to stay. I agree with Jason on that. I don't think this is going anywhere. And now that it's been a forced issue, I think it's going to be something that we're going to continue facing and growing into. And so I think it's going to become a new standard of practice. And so with that being the case, let's make sure we're doing it right. Let's just jump in there with both feet and grab on and learn as much as we can. I'm very fortunate. I have a very close friend of mine here in the Central Texas area who is he's a tech guru, and his son is one of the top programmers in the nation. And anytime I have a question, I'm buying that guy a pizza, right? And we're going to sit and have a conversation about security protocols and encryption. And the guy is very, very knowledgeable. So I found my guy. My challenge to everyone else is go out and find your guy. Find someone who's very knowledgeable about this. Partner up with them, buy them a pizza, have some conversations, have them look at your system to ensure that what you're doing is safe.
Well, and the just to briefly tag on to that, ours is not the only profession that COVID-19 kind of forced online. And so thankfully, I think we're going to be able to ride the coattails of other industries that are also adapting with things like Wi-Fi 6 coming along, and with faster data speeds both on cellular and Wi-Fi, and other new technologies that I'm not even aware of. The reliability and the speed of online is going to become more ubiquitous, not just for the people who have the money and the ability to invest in the infrastructure, but there are a lot of grassroots campaigns and initiatives to really get that technology laid out and provided for low-income people, and that's going to be a game changer, I think, in our field.
Absolutely.
I have a question just to pose to everyone. We seem to all be excited about the possibilities and opportunities that distance brings. But what are some ways that the practice of distance counseling can be abused?
For me, I think that one of the major factors that we're going to have to look at is identity verification. And I think that that will be something that probably at the licensure board level and at the billing levels, being able to make sure that the person that is representing themselves as a counselor and the person who is representing themselves as the client are indeed who they say they are. And so I think that is going to be a big piece of that question. The second part of that, I think, is that in many ways, we don't know what we don't know. And so I think that's the second part, is really being very honest with ourselves, because we're usually much more comfortable in the role of expert than in that of learner. And so I think we're going to have to be very honest with ourselves about that.
So it's an interesting question. Abuse. Did you mean abuse by the counselor, by the client?
By anyone who could be encountering this, yeah.
I certainly, I think there's some places where abuse can occur, but I think what's more likely is error, maybe not intentional error, but error to be sure. I worry about confidentiality a lot. I worry about accessibility in case of a crisis of some sort. I do worry about billing fraud. That once you open that gate and the gate has been opened, how do you? Okay, well, I can video conference and that's okay. Well, what if my client calls me? Can I just bill that? what if we're texting back and forth for a half an hour? Is that okay? So I could see some abuse in the billing area potentially emerging as well. But I think a lot of it is going to be unintentional error on counselors' parts in terms of, oops, I left my web camera on, or I didn't secure the room and now two of my clients are in the same room together with each other. Things like that I could see happening because people, and Dan, I had to laugh a little bit at your response about how do you become more competent, because what you were saying was be a nerd. And I agree 100%. I've also been around long enough to know most people don't want to. So how do you become nerdy enough to not make those kinds of errors and keep people safe is really the question.
In some of the platforms, especially one that we use in particular, it has preventive measures just for that. And so each client that does, if they do happen to pop in while you're still working with another client, they're in a waiting space. And so they have to be physically admitted to the virtual space in order for that to happen. And then it gives you a couple of prompts in between saying, are you sure you want to admit this person into a group room? And then so you have to say yes a couple of times for that to happen. And so I agree with that. And again, you don't have to, I don't think you have to completely become a nerd. I recommend it because you're going to understand the safeguards better. But it's one of those moments where being informed, the duty to understand it resides with the counselor. And with the duty for the client to understand resides with the counselor. And so, this is not up to the client to ensure their safety. It's up to the counselor to ensure that the client understands their safety. And so there's a lot of burden with this. There really is. And so making sure that you can do this and do this well, it's going to be incumbent upon the counselor.
In a way, it's kind of like it's kind of like in order to practice ethically and legally, you need to know something about the law. You don't need to become an attorney. You don't need to go to law school, but you need to know certain aspects of the law. Well, the same is true of the technological aspects of this. You don't need to become a computer programmer and a networking expert, but there are a few basics that you do need to know. And if you don't know, you need to do your research. And just as we have, attorneys that we may need to know, that we can call on, that we can ask certain question of, we need to have the same people with regards to the technology.
Well, I think that the other thing that I'm hearing in this conversation is that if you're not as technologically competent, if you're not sure of yourself, find a platform that dummy proofs it for you so you can't screw it up. Because I think where people put themselves at risk is they go, well, I don't know much about it, but I know how to use Skype. So I'll just throw Skype up and it will be fine and there won't be any problems. Where there are, as Dan was talking about, some really high quality products out there that limit the number of mistakes you can make because of the way the products are structured. And so picking a good product that has waiting rooms and has some of those safeguards in place for you so you don't have to think through it is going to be super critical. I know we're starting to run short on time, but I had a question for everybody because I see this pop up in regulation with some licensure boards. What are your thoughts about face-to-face relationship as a pre-existing condition to an online relationship in counseling? In other words, there are states that will say you can't do distance supervision unless you've met the person face-to-face and done some of that work first. Then you can do the online piece.
Well, that's what our practice actually had set up prior to COVID. So because we had the infrastructure, we had some, situations where, students would go off to college and wanted to, have the capacity to check in with their counselor while they're away at college. And so one of the stipulations that we've had in our informed consent procedures is just that before anybody engages in online telebehavioral health services, you need to have at least one in-office visit. Well, obviously COVID, I've seen probably, oh gosh, I don't even know now how many clients that just started, through COVID, through online services. So I think that's going to adapt to a degree. And I think we'll probably see some of those policies relaxing a bit. I don't know if we've changed our informed consent, to be honest. That's something that I'll definitely go back and look at because I think it'd be interesting to know. But yeah, I think that's one of those things that's probably going to become archaic pretty quickly.
I agree. I think that we're all face to face right now. I can see you, you can see me. And very often I've asked clients, especially couples or other people, when I'm asked them to sit a little bit back from the camera so I can see more of them and see, and I'll do the same thing so they can see a little bit more of me. But I challenge that because I think that we are face to face. I think it's virtual. I think there are some limitations with it, but by and large, this is still a face to face experience. And before we see new clients, we always ask for, when they're sending in their information, they transmit it to us, we ask for a photo ID. That way we know the person we're talking to is the person that we're supposed to be talking to. And so we can ensure that the veracity of the client. But
one of the solutions that we've come up with for some of our consultation clients is that there would be initial point of physical contact, but that wasn't necessarily with the counselor. So for a large agency, it might be the person who does intake, it might be a caseworker, it might be someone else. And so I think that one of the things we need to be intentional about is asking ourselves, do we want the physical contact because we're more comfortable with it, or because it's truly in the best interest of the client? And I think that as a profession is a big question that we need to pose to figure out how we do that well.
And Jenny, to that idea, I was going to say that, that's going to be a big difference, I think, between natives and immigrants. The natives are going to say, of course we can do it, face to face. And the immigrants who have had experience doing it both ways now, and maybe have a bias, myself included, toward the face to face. It's going to be an interesting discussion. I think that it's going to take both. Not one, group of folks and ways of doing it is going to be exactly right. So it's going to require some negotiation and discussion.
There's a little bit of research in this area, and it spans distance counseling, distance supervision, and even distance learning. And by and large, the research does indicate you get a better outcome if there's that grounded in-person experience first. That's not to say that it can't ever be successful if it's completely digital, because I think that there's enough evidence to prove that wrong. But what the literature I've read in the area tends to indicate is, hey, if I have a grounded experience with you, if you've been in the office a few times, or I've worked with you in the classroom, and then we move you online or move me online or whatever, that in general, because the relationship is a little bit easier to connect and to build, in general, the process overall tends to be a little bit more smooth. And maybe we just haven't figured out the right ways to mimic that in a virtual relationship. But it's something we're going to have to figure out, because a lot of states are very conflicted about this issue.
See, Jeff, and I would challenge that thinking, because I've got clients that I've started with exclusively online. We've built that relationship. We have a fantastic therapeutic rapport, and they've made significant milestones. And we've actually reduced back to, twice a month, because they're making those milestones. And again, I've never been in a physical space with those people. And so right. I would definitely say that this is something that can be done and it can be achieved. I really think that it depends on how you go about doing it.
Well, it could be an artifact of the people doing the research, because if immigrants are doing the research and they're doing the research on immigrants, maybe that's a different. So yeah, I'm not saying that research is foolproof, but it is something we have to think about intentionally.
Sure, absolutely. Sure. We have about 3 minutes. And so we wanted to kind of just see, what final thoughts do you have?
I'll just say that I think that I just go back to a point that I made earlier, that we're kind of at the beginning of our knowledge about all of this. And so I think to Jeff's point, we need a lot more research on these topics. I think that we need to see how theoretical models and how our kind of our noted theories of counseling that we all grew up with, how that do or do not adapt to the telehealth framework. We need to start looking at what forms of technology may be better suited for different kinds of clients than others. There's so many questions out there. I think it's incredibly presumptuous and wrong-headed to think that we know all there is to know about these topics, and that there is any kind of or what clients are the right clients for this, what clients are the wrong clients for this, and any kind of presumption about that is, in my opinion, entirely premature. And so there's a lot done there.
That's very well said. Jeff and Susan?
I'll just finish with one of the things from our chapter that talked about digital wisdom, right? And so, the use of technology alone can't replace intuition, good moral judgment, those kinds of things. So while technology is fabulous as a conduit, we can't leave our brains at the door.
All right, Jeff?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that's been said. We're new and early to this whole ball game. As somebody who's pretty techie, I urge moderation. So I think it's easy to go all in and say, well, technology will fix all things, or to go the other direction and say, see, I was right, this is terrible. I think there's somewhere in a middle ground. And if we take that kind of tempered approach, as we look at these issues, that it really can benefit clients. It can create opportunities for clients who didn't have access to services. And we can mitigate some of the problems that come with the platform if we're thoughtful and we don't forget that wisdom that Susan was talking about.
This is a great place to kind of wrap it up. We need to move forward with caution, and we need to make sure that we all are willing to learn and research further. I think that's incredibly sound wisdom. As we're kind of bringing this to a close, we just want to mention a few things. One is we want to mention the Counseling Delphi website, CounselingDelphi.net, and a few topics for the future panels.
So coming in April, Gina Martin leads a panel on the topic of neuroscience in counseling.
Coming in May, Elliot Ingersoll leads a panel on the topic of treatment and psychedelic drugs.
Coming in June, Eric Perry leads a panel on the topic of establishing connections with students in a virtual space.
We want to thank everyone who came out tonight to view this initial panel, and we want to thank the panelists themselves. These are some of the people that we respect most highly in the profession, and we want to thank Dr. Marty Gentius. He's just a visionary in this area of counseling, and we are just very, very grateful to him.
The book can be purchased. We've got links on our website. I threw that up in the chat. www.consultpax.com. That's consultpax.com. The book is available in both print format and in digital form, ebook. Also, all proceeds from this book go to support Uganda Counseling and Support Services. It's an organization that we helped establish in Uganda. It's one of our former graduate students who went out there and took his counseling education and went to Uganda and has been building schools, churches, hospitals, model farming, drilling wells, and
counseling services and clean water.
Absolutely, that's where it started. And so all proceeds go to support that organization. And so we're very proud to be a part of that process, and we're very proud that all proceeds will go to help him and the people in Uganda.
And we're really grateful to all the authors who said that that's 100% they're behind that idea. And so we're always happy to support students and support people who are out doing the hard work in counseling.
And taking counseling to other countries and other communities.
Absolutely.
All right, so thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you.